Welcome everyone to our members webinar. I am Rebecca Schwartz, the Community Engagement Manager at Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute. I am very pleased to introduce our presenter today, Francesca Maximé. She will be speaking on why it's hard to talk about racism in the therapeutic world. We are offering this webinar for free to the wider community due to the importance of this topic, and we encourage you to keep this topic alive by staying in the discomfort that may arise. And please consider donating to our BIPOC scholarship by going to our website, www.traumahealing.org, and visit our donate page. Francesca is an SEP, certified mindfulness meditation teacher, Indigenous focusing practitioner, life coach, relational life couples coach, executive and organizational coach, and well-being guide based in Brooklyn, New York, and she works online worldwide. With the time remaining after her presentation, we will be taking a few questions from the Q&A. And it is with great appreciation I turn the webinar over to Francesca.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and to everyone who may be watching and listening. You just caught a glimpse there of the womb from which I came. That was my mother, as I'm here in Ashland, Massachusetts, where I grew up right now, although I reside in Brooklyn, New York right now. And I'm here on Nipmuc land, Nipmuc territory, which I did not know. The name of our teams, the Nipmucs, were for an homage to the First Nations people who are here, but that in fact, that is the case. So I'm just taking a moment here to just ground and breathe as I share a little bit about where I am, where you are. Maybe just taking a moment to check in your surroundings and just sort of take in the room as we do in somatic experiencing at times, and maybe just in general, noticing where you are in space and time. Maybe checking in with twisting from torso, left and right, just letting your body know it has movement, it has agency, it can respond now when we sort of electively want to be able to move it into a certain posture or direction. And just arriving here together. We have about 100 participants on the call right now, which is beautiful. And unfortunately, I cannot see your beautiful faces, although I would love to. And I'm just imagining us resonating in this shared virtual space together. And I'm also just holding this shared connection that we have with all beings, all around the world, all sentient beings, and the earth and the planet and the cosmos itself, that we're not separate from any of that, that we are connected in our own ways, and that we are also unique. And so to that end, just a little bit about my own personal background for some who may or may not be curious about that. My pronouns are she and we. I am Haitian Dominican and Italian American. My mother is the Italian one. My father was Haitian and Dominican. And I am mixed ethnicity. I identify as a woman of culture, as our friend and fellow SEP Resma Menachem talks about. I also have enjoyed a certain degree of lighter white-skinned privilege, or some people might say passing. And I also recognize that there are, in addition to racism and prejudice ideas that can come up along with that for some people, also this sort of objectification and fetishization that can happen at times around sort of the intersectionality piece and possibly that power and equity piece as it pertains to more of the misogynistic piece. And so just recognizing that I hold a lot of those identities and have been experiencing the world through these different othered lenses of how I'm viewed or how I've been seen. And as I just sit here and breathe and share that with you and just let that settle, just notice your feet on the floor and seat in the chair. As we begin to sort of explore in an embodied way and in this sort of like self-disclosure, revelatory, perhaps sharing kind of way, what it's like for me is this woman who has a certain background to be invited to share with you in this way about why it's so hard to talk about racism in the therapeutic world. And just to that end, I'd like to, for a moment, invite in, and again, recognizing this is the Tibetan singing bowl that I'm about to tap, that some may view this as culturally appropriative, and that perhaps it is, and that in some ways I've asked for permission as this bowl was given to me to be able to ring it in the honor of all of the ancestors, all of that's come before, all that has yet to come, and the wholeness of who we are. Just inviting in this energy of relaxed and alert, noble and dignified. Each one of us with our own inherent dignity and worth, no better or worse than anyone, no more or less than anyone. Embodied in a particular place and time, and space and time. Embedded in these structural systems that may or may not enable us to have certain advantages, either racially, either based on our orientation, either based on perhaps our ability, and maybe just checking in with whomever's on the call, since I cannot see you right now, unfortunately, what that might be for you. Where am I in this big space? Where do I locate myself? How am I located? What are the ways in which other people see me that I don't particularly identify with? And I'll try to see if I can share my screen. I don't know if I can, but I'll try. Are you able to see that? I think so. It's a little messy. I'll try to close out some of these other things. And maybe just checking in, because what we're talking about today is structural racism, institutional racism, and why it's so hard to talk about it, especially in the therapeutic world, and the ways in which perhaps certain things get in the way. So when we look at this chart, maybe just think about where are we in this? Privilege, power, access, resources at the center. Thinking about who tends to have access to those. White, male, ruling, wealthy, US born, able-bodied, Protestant or Catholic, heterosexual, that those sort of tend to center there. And as we move further and further out, in terms of what a supremacist, what a better than, worse than valuing kind of society views, what happens when we add in things like biracial or multiracial, like me, female as opposed to male, if we go further with transgender or intersex, what happens when we think about able-bodied, a sensory disability, if we identify as queer, atheist, if we weren't born here, if we don't even speak English. How do all these intersect, and how do they play out in our own showing up? How are we with this? And how are we with everyone viewing us through certain lenses? And what is it like when we think about the fact that we all have this, as I said earlier, this innate dignity, this ability, relaxed and alert, no better or worse than, and that we are also subject to the way in which my friend Lama Rod Owen says, I don't get to consent to the way other people view me. I don't get to consent to the way other people view me. So what does that mean in terms of I want to claim my agency, just like we were doing with our orienting and just checking in. And also, I also know who I am, but I also don't get to consent to that. And what is it like to sort of claim that and take that now, even in this moment? I'm alive and I'm real. I'm relaxed and alert. And this is a conversation that may be a bit charged. We may notice that something is coming up for us, that there may be more or less. Is it possible to have a slide or link to the privilege diagram? Sure, I can send that to folks, yes. Maybe as a follow-up. The social location piece, absolutely. Gladys, I believe, thank you. So in any case, this idea that we sometimes get contracted into this body, we are an embodied spirit. There tends to be this smaller sense of self sometimes that, as we know in somatic experiencing, plays out in the way in which our nervous system responds to what it is that either is perceived as threat or is actual threat, or both. And that for certain people with different kinds of melanated skin tones in a white supremacist structure, that there are going to be not only the perception of threat or the reality of threat that is different, there's going to be a whole experience that's an intergenerational, transgenerational experience that if we are in a white body, we may not actually really have a sense of. We may have a sense of what it's like to have the imprintings that we uniquely have, that may be about being, in my case, for example, a single child of a single mother and this kind of a town that I grew up in, and the way in which, sort of the ways in which my mixed ethnicity has played out. But I may not have a sense of what it's like to experience a collective in certain kinds of ways that someone else may have. And just noticing neither is right or wrong, neither is good or bad. But to kind of lean into this idea of, okay, so there's a part of me that has received this certain kind of imprinting, and there's difference, and there's a space where there's someone else who can exist not precisely like me. So as we go forward, maybe one of the things that I would invite you to consider, sort of reflecting on the social location, reflecting on the fact that talking about structural racism and also our own personal imprintings can be challenging, that we might have somatic reactions to that, to either push away, want to zone out, want to check out, that we may want to lean in and we want to kind of, dig in further, or that we may just want to sort of pretend it's not happening, if you will, that there are different parts of us that are all kind of going to be present. And can we make space for all of those? And can we bring in any kind of resources that we might need? That we may have something that might feel nourishing to us in this moment. In a system of supremacy, or in a category, as Resmaa Menakem again talks about white body supremacy, what we know that the real affliction is in terms of the way in which the United States was founded and the history of the way in which anti-Black racism exists today, and that we're seeing manifest after George Floyd, after Breonna Taylor, after Ahmaud Arbery, and even incidents like Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in Central Park, where the use of police force is threatened to a Black body, that we're recognizing that there's really a difference in the way in which the privilege of those in white bodies exists, and the access, whether aware of or not, at the necessary expense of others based on skin color, which we know is a construct, but also a lived reality, and how that plays out. And so what degree, or to what degree, are we able or willing to lean into the fact that in this system of whiteness, which is in fact the air, or better I say the carbon monoxide, if you will, that we are all breathing, that is killing all of us, that is part of the division or the separation or the real sort of wall in between what we can feel and do often feel when we just feel just right. whether it's with our dog or with our child or with a tree or by a river, that we know when we do feel more safe, that we know when we do feel more connected to ourselves and potentially to the world. And that some folks, like some of my clients who are Black, who, for example, grew up in Brooklyn, one was telling me the other day, I don't have an experience where I'm not on alert. I don't have an experience where I grew up not being anxious. I don't have an experience of being 12 or 14 and being carefree the way that my white wife did. I don't have that experience. I don't know what that's like. And just holding both. Not inside our body, but just breathing. Noticing that the land, the air, the sky can hold the reality of what happens in these systems of oppression. And that when we are inhabiting a white body, we may bump into things like, what is whiteness? I'm not racist. I'm not prejudiced. I love all people. I am someone who doesn't see color. I do my part. I've been in a helping profession for a long time. And some of those things may be true, and some of them may or may not be more helpful to explore or to unpack when it comes to working with people. Because a person of color, of course, may not feel, rightly so, that their uniqueness is celebrated, that their own place in the world as being who they are as an individual is really recognized and attuned to, as we know from attachment theory, feeling safe, seen, and soothed, really feeling met and presenced. If someone says, I don't see color, what does that mean for the person who has been given a category of color that they didn't ask for? And how might it be more supportive to say, I see you just as you are. I recognize that there is difference around this, and I also respect your common dignity and humanity. And I'm here with you, curious, not needing to be right, undefended. Is there a part of me that can be present to the parts of myself that feel like there is a need to keep things at bay or away, to say I'm not racist, to say that I don't harbor these ideas, or there aren't parts of me that have learned these imprintings and that my nervous system hasn't developed this habit? Are there parts of me that lean that way? And if so, can I be with them in a way that I can, in attending to them, be present to people with whom I may have a different experience as constructed in this society of whiteness and of oppression? And as I begin to practice that with myself, acknowledging, leaning in, no longer what we resist persists, but yes, here, this too. Yes, this too, this part of me. Yes, this too, this part of me. How might that open up space for others to feel safer in our presence? And when in fact we have not done the work and we don't really know the history of the United States, as I did not, in many ways, I was very much a protected, light, white-skinned, passing, privileged person who had not really done this work until my mentor, Dr. Jack Kornfield, mindfulness teacher, former monk, clinical psychologist, invited me into this space to say, you might want to look into that. Look into what? Whiteness. Not Black as a race, not Asian American as a race, not Latinx as a race, as a people, as a culture, but the whole system of really how we came to be in this country. And really, as I started to unpack that and learn more about chattel enslavement of people, kidnapping of people, the doctrine of discovery, the religious leaders that put out this go forth and conquer, the depth of the genocide of First Nation and Indigenous people here on Turtle Island in North America, the ways in which that domination was so fearful and so forced that as people were coming over in the Middle Passage by the millions, that people who were breathing and were alive were literally, and again, grounding ourselves as I share some of these details, recognizing that at any time, if this webinar doesn't feel right or feel safe, or if there's charge or if there are issues, that there's agency. This is recorded, we can always come back or not. That people who were brought over, who were kidnapped, who were enslaved, were even thrown overboard breathing for insurance money. How and what kind of a system exists where that was what was rewarded? People are not people, but property, and that women and Black women were used to continue to give birth to children born into slavery generation after generation, that there was no way out after 7 years, and that the systems kept that in there and do in many ways, with redlining, with FHA loans, with all the kinds of systems in our schools, school to prison pipeline that we know of, that trauma exists in a cultural body and a somatic body in whiteness here in the United States of America, North America, Turtle Island, and that this is a legacy that we all, regardless of whether or not we've immigrated here, regardless of whether or not we were born here, regardless of whether or not we are light or white-skinned, or whether we're Black or we're multi-ethnic or Asian, that we all have imprintings based on this system of oppression and exclusion. Some of them internal, some of them aware, some of them shadowed and beneath the pyramid, under the water. So how do we hold this? How do we start to lean in when we're trying to work with our parts that get outraged, rightly so, that feel attacked, that feel, and that are? We're witnessing a moment in time, a collective awakening. Social determinants of health, we know racism is the primary precondition for who lives or dies because of COVID as we continue to exist in this pandemic. And that's based on structural centuries of policy that has been enacted and is carefully, even presently, continuing to be reinforced and enacted to benefit the elite at the expense of the masses. And that often means white cis het men at the expense of people of color, and specifically Black Americans, Black people in this country. And so when we go into our therapy sessions, when we go into our somatic experience sessions, when we go into our one-on-one, when we're talking about why is it hard to talk about racism, what do you notice even as coming up in this talk right now? Is she doing a good job? Is she not? Where is she going? She doesn't know what she's talking about. Maybe she does. I don't really get it. Okay, maybe making space for that. Am I feeling ashamed? I should have done more. I didn't really learn. I didn't know. They didn't teach me this in school. I want to go hide. Just noticing that. Do I remember I have an essential self, that I'm enough and I matter anyway, no matter who I am or where I come from? Do I feel connected to something greater than me? Can I feel my feet on the floor? Can I remember that I'm part of this universe? and that I've endured a lot of trauma, and that I've endured a lot of charge, and that I'm here and I'm breathing. And that there's a both and. How are we as individuals, and how are we in the collective? And in the collective, we often, as individuals, dip in and out of organizations. We dip in and out of structures, whether it's families or schools or houses of worship or whatnot. We even become a part of a community like the SETI community, the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute. And we may say or experience that I have experienced trauma within this organization, that this organization, although it is trauma healing, misses the mark when it comes to talking about not only race and racism, but embodying it in a way that feels safe to me. That there's something that feels like it's not getting gotten. That there isn't this feeling of safe, seen, and soothed when applying or managing or dealing with the scholarship. That when the faculty is being, is teaching in intermediate 2, I believe, perhaps 3, on, sort of multicultural and racism and trauma, that there's a few hours devoted to that, perhaps. I know I did a demo there with a white male faculty member that left me feeling profoundly unattuned to and unsettled. And I know that there are a lot of people who have experienced harm and a lot of people who are no longer part of the somatic experiencing community, because as they have leaned into doing the trauma work in this container, they've realized that it is not a safe one for them. And so they leave. And those of you who are here are ones who've stayed or perhaps are part of the larger community. And this exists not only in SETI, but in a lot of the mindfulness and in a lot of the trauma communities and in a lot of the therapeutic communities. That organizationally, there's a lack perhaps of humility around the fact that we are not all having the same experience. This return to safety isn't as easily accessible for some people who have been cut out, and as was done with George Floyd, kneeled upon and cannot breathe in that way. And so inviting in this sense of, okay, whiteness. Whiteness is about narcissism. Narcissism is kind of a lack of humility. Why would one need to defend in that way? Why would one need to kind of, back off? As therapists, as practitioners, what parts of us emerge sometimes to need to defend and feel like we're going to keep it at bay or away? Is it because we're trying to protect? Why would an organization feel as though sort of fumbling the ball, I've heard this. I know a lot of people have been working in the racial justice initiatives and a lot of the initiatives. Sabi Wade was just elected to the board, the Black Doula, which I'm thrilled for and excited about. And in the course that she offered recently asked, what is it like to be taught by me, a Black queer woman? How is that for you? What are you noticing? And we can ask the same of our clients and of the faculty. What are we noticing when we're being taught by white male practitioners or white female practitioners? What are the conversations that we're not having? What are the ways in which we've tried to have those conversations but feel like we need more? When do we give up, check out, walk away? How many microaggressions have we endured? What do those look like for us? In life in general, but also in these organizations, even in these spaces where we purport to actually hold space for one another and be part of a trauma healing or resolution community. I've had a lot of conversations with people I just did a webinar earlier today for a class that I'm offering this fall with Dick Schwartz of Internal Family Systems. And he talks a lot about the cultural legacy burdens of materialism, individualism, patriarchy, and racism. And, you know, he admits being a white man of a certain generation and age who, you know, is also Jewish and who even just today on the call said, you know, that experience of saying, but I'm Jewish, I was also oppressed, and anti-Black racism in the United States, he's like, there's no comparison. Because of the way in which people who are Black have to endure living in a white supremacist society today. And the ways in which, with that whiteness and that inheritance of the privilege, the racial advantage, as Resmaa would say, that comes along with being white, enables a certain kind of facility. So all of these make it difficult to bring up these things in session and organizationally also. Yesterday I posted on Instagram, which Rebecca retweeted or whatever you call it, reposted for the Instagram somatic experiencing. What's your experience of a microaggression? What are your experiences there? Have you had any? And if so, what are they? And they weren't specific to being, you know, in the somatic experiencing container, but certainly could include that. And that in that, there were 110 responses, I want to say, 111 responses here from people who feel like they've been harmed through microaggressions. And again, as I put in the post, micro is not appropriate, meaning all micros are macro, right? As we've said, 1,000 paper cuts, and that these can kill also. These can hurt our spirit. One reads, my favorite microaggression is when white people who have never ever even mentioned race, color, and or have completely shunned and cowered from such discussions tell me that they're now organizing diversity training at work. I always feel a heap of sympathy for their BIPOC coworkers. Yeah. Another one says, what are you? I've gotten that question from as young as I remember up to pre-quarantine. My mind instantly whirls with evaluating the situation and how much energy I want to put into it. How much energy do we want to have to put into correcting someone? If someone's a smartass and I want to say I'm human, or somebody who's more polite than you, then I face confrontation and a heap of emotions. If I answer with patience and politeness, I feel like I placated that person, and I still face a heap of emotions. Other people's ignorance feels like negative emotional baggage that was shoved off on me without a choice. Again, who has agency in a white body supremacist society, in this carbon monoxide of whiteness? And whom is it incumbent on to interrogate whiteness? How does it live in me, regardless of who I am and what I look like? Yes, I'm looking at these answers. I mean, these questions in the chat box. No, Alicia. The webinar will also talk about the challenges of being a Black therapist. And Senta, the lack of safety I'm referring to is experienced primarily for BIPOC. So maybe Senta, I'll get to that question first. But before I do that, I want to see if I can show you another slide. And show you this piece. I'm really not a tech person when it comes to these things, but I'll do my best here. Can you see that? I think so. world population, this is last year's 7.6 billion. Obviously, it's gone up. But just look at the percentage of people and the ethnicity of people: Asian, African, and then European, then Latinx, then North American, Oceania, AAPI, obviously. And so who's the global majority? And how's that going to change over the next couple of decades? So just really taking this in, noticing that this system really is about, this system of white racial advantage is about dominance and extraction for a certain population. But that it's kind of erroneous, moot, insofar as who the people actually are that exist in the world. And so to kind of just maybe delve into what Alicia's asking here, the challenges of being a Black therapist and dealing with racism in the therapy room be addressed? Yes. I'd like to hear more from you on that. Meaning, I don't know how to do this. Answer live? I don't know if that means that, Madeline, does that mean that someone gets to speak from their microphone? The challenges of being a Black therapist and dealing with racism in the therapy room. I'd like to hear more from the questioner, but I'm not hearing anything. Is that possible or no?
That's not possible during this webinar.
Okay, that's fine. So I'll do the best that I can, Alicia, with your question. I'm sorry, I would have liked to have heard more from you about that. So centering whiteness or decentering whiteness and building a multiracial society, environment, or therapy session obviously is something that we all are working toward if we are trying to be an embodied anti-racist, working toward collective liberation. Now, the question is, are we? Or are we just existing with the current reality, and what are we really trying to do? Certainly, the experiences of being a Black therapist and dealing with racism in the therapy room are going to be experienced differently based on whoever the client is. I guess I'm trying to pinpoint the gist of your question. I can tell you the ways in which I know that I have experienced certain things happening where, you know, psychiatrists have been thought of as social workers. I've, you know, Black psychiatrists, that people who have been, you know, the actual therapist have been asked to be, you know, the person who cleans up because there's no one who believes that, you know, that person is the therapist. I know in Black Psychoanalysts Speak, which is a great movie if you've not watched it, Kenneth Vaughn talks about the way in which there just really isn't an attention paid to what that dynamic is like when someone is in a power dynamic in the therapy session and sort of makes assumptions. But I guess I can't, unless you can. I guess I'm not really sure how to get more. If you can, Alicia, if you can elaborate perhaps in adding another question. I don't know there. But I mean, if we're going to just talk about the fact that a Black therapist will have a different experience in the ways in which all the microaggressions can accumulate, either from the clients who may want to barter to pay less, or that there may be people who don't believe that you're actually a qualified PhD as a therapist, or that the ways in which when we're holding space together as therapists, as someone who is BIPOC or Black identified, that we may be in a space where, you know, if we challenge anything or say that there's an issue with anything, that we may have to meet someone else coming back at us to say you're angry, or, you know, that's just your own personal experience, or you're making that up, or, you know, I'm not that way. I don't know how to validate that further. I'm making these up. I don't know if that's what you're getting at or pointing to. racism in the therapy room? Perhaps if you have a white client who's coming to you who has racist ideas, how might you be able to work with them? Perhaps saying something along the lines of, you know, I'm hearing that there's a part of you that feels as though certain people should be able to just work harder. And I'm wondering if we can work with that. This part that, you know, feels as though really we all have the same opportunity, and, you know, you should just be able to move forward into that. And again, what is it like to have to experience that while holding your own, but also opening up to what their experience is? I'm going to move on to Senta's question. Alicia, I don't know that I've really fully addressed what you're asking me, but if there's more, please put it in there. Senta Teresa, I'm curious if this lack of safety you're referring to is experienced primarily for BIPOC. As I said, I think anyone can experience a lack of safety. But I think that given a white supremacist society, most necessarily Black identified people, especially at this moment, what we've continued to see with everyone from, as I said, you know, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, everyone over time, and people just continuing to not get it, white therapists included, who purport to be in the helping professions and oftentimes enter into, you know, this space of being well-intentioned, but not necessarily having the embodiment or the education to go along with it, that can be challenging. Sarah Bhavani, could you please mention something around how to work with clients experiencing the trauma of racism when that trauma is ongoing in society? Also, how to acknowledge societal trauma in an individual? Yeah, I mean, Sarah, to your point there, I have a lot of clients who are Black and many who are mixed and many who are TGNC and couples who are interracial. So there's a Black client and, you know, and the couple and a white client. So the trauma of racism, for example, when the COVID was happening and then there were the protests, I, you know, recall one of my clients basically saying to me that he wanted to go away with his white girlfriend for her birthday in another month or so, but had to drive to Florida. That was their plan initially because they wanted to get out of where they were because it was too dense. And that when things started happening, was very afraid of what would happen if he got pulled over. And so we sort of literally crafted a safety plan. Well, what would happen? What would you say? What would you do? What might be resourcing? What are the kinds of ways in which, you know, you can make stops along the way and not just end up being in some completely random route, all holding that none of that should be necessary, because in a society that isn't structured this way with police violence, that we wouldn't have that happen, but ways in which one can try to accommodate that. But I just acknowledged it. I acknowledge the fact that you're right. In this society at this moment, we're dealing with police who are the outcome of slave patrols, the night patrols, which in this country were founded to go and reclaim property, and that's what we see manifested today. And that this moment may not be a safe moment, and that doesn't make it fair, and that doesn't make it right. But the structures and the systems that are in place right now continue to perpetuate the power that police have and the way in which that's played out in a violent way, often in microaggressions in subtle ways, and also very overtly, as we've seen, on Black bodies. Clients experiencing the trauma of racism. I've had another client who's mixed ethnicity, who's Black, but also Asian, and also is dating someone who's white. And when that trauma is ongoing in society, what is it like to be in an interracial relationship when eugenicists have, claimed that miscegenation is the demise of the white race or the Caucasian race. What does that mean to actually hold that in your body? That right now, there are people who are the outcome of others who would not have there be what was once called race mixing, that don't advocate for this. That you can hold yourself in positive, warm regard, that a lot of my clients try and educate their counterpart, like my Black client was trying to educate her white boyfriend about what he doesn't experience, what he doesn't understand. But the real work is, and I sort of gave them some resources that he could go to and that he could learn about what it's like and how his experience is necessarily different. Yes, he's Irish. Yes, he's an immigrant. And yes, Irish have their own history of assimilation and not being considered white in the United States. That's true also, but that given the way that society is currently structured, that he has an advantage. Now he thinks she's amazing and beautiful and smart and intelligent and all those things, but that doesn't account for the fact that she experiences racism in a certain way. And she carries her own intergenerational racism from her father, for example, who, felt left out of jobs on banking and Wall Street, and then is sort of putting that into his children and wanting them to live out that legacy, but that he felt that he was excluded because of race, which he probably was, because all of those indicators are there in terms of who does or doesn't get to access the C-suite. How to acknowledge societal trauma in an individual. Well, when we look at intergenerational trauma and we look at people, the idea of having societal trauma manifest in the ways in which we show up in our somatic body, that they're not two. They're not two. So the idea that this larger dominant context is part of the ways in which we have to hold our own personal experience doesn't leave us a lot of room. Meaning, for example, I think of some of the folks who are, that I have as clients who are Jewish, and the ways in which there is that inheritance of societal and intergenerational trauma from their genocide, and that plays out in the ways in which they interact with their children, interact with their friends and family, and that with Black families, with a Black individual, with one of my Black clients, I know, for example, that a lot of the inheritance of what it's like to have had a single, Black mother, very strong, having that idea of having to endure, having to survive, all of those amazing, beautiful things that we bless and are grateful to our ancestors for, that societal trauma is affecting them in how they feel safe in their neighborhood or not, or only feel safe when they're able to be with their white wife. And so I would invite them to notice, is there any place in the body where that feels greater? Is this all yours? Does this all belong to you? To whom might else it belong? What are you noticing here? Is there something about that? I would work more with metaphor. Maybe see if there's a way in which there's a way to call up images. Use Cybam, perhaps. Santa Teresa, not to diss the theme, just got on here. I'm 66 white female, would understand if not appropriate here. No, I think we went over that a little bit. Joanne Klassen, as a woman, I learned in feminism that people with power rarely give it up voluntarily. That's true. As a white woman who is a therapist, I've sometimes not raised race in therapy because I've assumed people know that I have good intentions. In the last number of years, I've noticed that good intentions are not good enough. Okay, bravo. I've been raising race in therapy much more often, and I've recognized that to do so requires me to be undefensively open to having unwitting microaggressions pointed out and to receive what people say as an opportunity to give up some of my power voluntarily, right? I am trying to confront my white fragility in this way. I am in Canada. Thank you. Thank you for that. And again, to the previous point of Alicia, not trying to overly center whiteness, but also acknowledging that we need partners, co-conspirators, comrades, and allies to begin to do this work and wake up. And it will never be enough soon enough, meaning that, we still haven't yet rebalanced this, obviously, but that this is part of the work. Holding the shame, holding the fragility, holding the learning, being teachable, having the humility to be able to be present to when a Black woman especially is speaking to you. Listen and just hold that and allow that to be present, right? When someone who has been marginalized, as we did the social location piece, by others is speaking about their own direct experience, can we be generous of heart? Can we be open? Can we hold on to our own presence and listen undefended? And if it calls up something in us that makes us feel like we're too vulnerable, again, reminding that part of us that feels very vulnerable that we're here and that we're here in presence and listening. That right now I'm doing the collective healing for all the ancestors and all the people here, that this isn't just for me. And in Canada, of course, there's the history of the residential schools. There's a history of the 60s scoop. There's the history of the indoctrination of, Christian beliefs in much the same way that there was in the United States. That all these intuitive ways of knowing, which frankly, SE are pretty much based on. Let's face it, I don't think anybody really invented this. They put it together. So there's shamanistic principles. We know about polyvagal theory. We know the ways in which reverberations and vibrations and co-regulation and mirror neurons all sense, all add to a sense of safety that we have as individuals. But as a cultural body, that also adds to it too. And in an indigenous culture, that's much more present. There's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Yellowbird that I actually interviewed yesterday or the day before about this. And he speaks beautifully about all the ways in which collectivist cultures and not individualist imperialist cultures like the United States actually have all of the healing there. And about what you say, Joanne, about giving up some of my power voluntarily, it's not as much, if you can think about it, Dr. Janet Helms, who wrote the stages of, racial identity development, and I can share that with you also. Meaning that there's the contact stage, there's the color blindness stage, there's the, part where I'm, trying to make a contribution. There's the, for white people, there's for, Black people, there's a sense of, contact or, sort of Black power, if you will. I think, Reverend Jackie Lewis was talking about where she was like, supporting a pick in her afro and things like that. And then there's this more like coherence and investigation phase. And then there's coming to this place of more like being with, that we're not giving up power, we're rebalancing. We're allowing there to be a rebalancing, a bottom-up rebalancing. That already I have more than my share. I took the whole pie. I was only supposed to have a small slice. This isn't all for me. It never was intended that way. In order for me to bring this home and have this in front of me right now, it's at the expense of others not having access to food. That isn't right. That my moral center knows intuitively that there is a rebalancing there. And that it will take adjustment and discomfort to let some of that go and to do differently. But it also means, can we open up to the richness of what we may receive unknowingly, because we've never not been in that myopic, more, straw way, that we can actually open up to receiving the abundance and not just place the uncertainty around, it's going to be bad. But what might it be like to have less, perhaps, power in that way that I think of it, and more empowerment collectively? What might it be like to sit in that? Denise Fajardo Springer, therapists of color having to hold space for white therapists, or therapists of color having to hold space for white clients to process racism. Challenging, protect your energy. Wanting to make sure, for sure, that, that there's a lot of resourcing there, right? So actually, as we do that, let's just maybe pause, feel our feet on the floor and breathe. Take in anything that's good here. Notice if there's anything that's coming up that's like, again, you know, I'm not enjoying this. This isn't really satisfying, or gee, this is kind of interesting, but I'm looking for more here. Okay, holding that, it's possible, but also looking around. It's 2020, it's August 4th, we're in the middle of a pandemic and the uprising. And I'm breathing. And I'm blessed to be here with you all. So, therapists of color, having to hold space for white clients to process racism. In therapeutic circles, obviously, there's a lot of talk around self-care, resourcing. Some of you are familiar with, I'm sure, the NAP ministry, which encourages self-care and really having limits and boundaries. And anyone who's, trained in SC knows what it's like to do those approach avoid exercises and to feel what it's like when you're with a client who knows when they have a boundary around something and they're able to articulate that, perhaps for the first time. I was doing something with someone the other day and their mother and sister were rather boundaryless. And as I was doing this exercise, I kind of said, what is it like for you now if I do this? And you're noticing what happens in your body there. And just notice, how is that for you? And then notice what happens. I don't know if I can do it on this chair. Notice what happens as I sort of come a little bit closer in. And what feels like the place that's right to you. Or do you really want me here? Or do you want me more like here? And just notice what happens. And my client was very clear and just went, stop, when they knew that this was enough. And so again, checking in, therapists of color having to hold space for white clients to process racism. Oftentimes I'll say something along the lines of, here's what's happening. Here's the story about this that I'm telling myself about what's happening. And I'm also holding space, meaning that I don't have to take this in. So how can I stay connected and grounded to my own experience, boundaried, knowing that I don't have to let everything that's being said by this client talking about racism penetrate me and come in? That there's a part of me that can stay online and be with the experience of what it's like to hear racist words and to invite in perhaps further inquiry and say, when, I hear you discussing this in this way, what's coming up for me is curiosity around how you came to start to believe that. Or when did you first notice that you felt that way or thought that way? Or what was it like for you to experience, that interaction the first time? But again, having a boundary and having a limit and going and doing your kind of resourcing. The other day I was on a seminar with the New York Association of Black Psychologists around Black joy and also empowering the Black mind, sort of navigating white fragility. And we're doing a follow-up conversation about the ways in which there's dancing and there's barbecuing and there's music and there's gathering around the knitting circle, and that there's all kinds of ways to help resource yourself. So when you're forced to hold space with a client that espouses these kinds of views or having to process them, that you have maybe tools that you can give them in book recommendations and say, yeah, well, here are some resources if you want to explore that a little bit more, or I'm wondering what your understanding of whiteness is, or I'm wondering, what your first experience was of race. When did you first notice it? Maybe being invitational and curious. Marita McLaughlin, I'm wondering if it's possible to create 100% safety for anyone. I'm considering the possibility of creating brave space. Oh, I like that, Marita. Brave space. Right, because there's something in that that's beautiful about your question or your comment about having a courageous heart. Having a courageous heart to create space that is, in fact, the window of tolerance that is large enough to hold both that someone is coming in here with imprintings and parts that espouse racist views based on their experiences and based on the current collective experience of whiteness in society now, and the way that that plays out not only structurally, but even right here in the power dynamic in the room. But can I create enough space that's brave, enough space that feels like it's wider? And what does that look like? And what do I need there with me? Is it a mammoth, a woolly mammoth? Is it a nice blanket that my grandmother knit? What is it that I need that's a brave space? Wonder Woman, Black Panther, Dr. Martin Luther King. What is going to help me have a brave space? The tiger? We need the energy of the tiger sometimes. We need to evoke and wake our inner tiger within, that healthy defense, that healthy aggression. And being with that life force that wants to come forward, that has that courageous heart, cure, to be with the creation of that brave space and hold it. The eye in the storm. Still a storm of white supremacy, and that this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And there's particular things that we can do here in our therapy rooms and in our families and in our spaces. And there are safer spaces, right? Oftentimes that's why we want to create Black only spaces, white only spaces, Indigenous only spaces, multiracial spaces, multi-ethnic spaces, AAPI spaces, spaces based on certain age group, orientation, ability, you name it, so that we can have honest conversations about the thing that we're talking about without getting so re-traumatized by being in, for example, a multiracial space that isn't ready to have that conversation, that isn't ready to hold that. I was in, of all things, my college Facebook group that created a subgroup called Reading About Racism. And so they're reading Ibram Kendi, they're reading Ta-Nehisi Coates and another author this summer. And there was a lot of back and forth around a lot of vitriol. And these are, and I say this again, noting social location, I say this for the point of information. These are Ivy League graduates who are in middle life right now, who have a degree of education and privilege. And that it was very much a reflection of what we see in our society today. Vitriol, name calling. I think someone said someone was a brown supremacist, which was new for me. So creating that brave space necessitates that we hold it within ourselves, but that we also don't only hold it in ourselves, that we open up to the knowledge, the wisdom, the land that can hold what we can hold. Rita Khan asks, it can be challenging when our white clients express subtle or not so subtle white privilege or racist attitudes. As a white therapist, I'm caught between my usual empathetic orientation and an urge to challenge and educate the client. It can be hard to do both at the same time. I've had a hard time being empathetic with racist or entitled attitudes. Good. I'm glad you have a hard time being empathetic with racist or entitled attitudes and not a hard time being empathetic with the person, right? Meaning, again, both are true. There's the part or the attitude or the imprinting that has learned the racism or the entitlement, and that causes a lot of harm or can cause a lot of harm when acted upon knowingly or unknowingly, microaggression wise, or large or in a larger, more structural way around things like policy. So I think the meat of your question is my usual empathetic orientation and an urge to challenge and educate. So again, I think this goes back to the piece about being invitational. My friend and colleague, Dr. Natasha Stovall, who wrote a article that you may be familiar with called Whiteness on the Couch, she and I do a sort of web TV show on Wednesdays at noontime, where she explores, as a white identified woman, expressly that, how to sort of titrate the experience around when is it good to drop in the piece around a power and equity imbalance, and educating and doing perhaps psychoeducation around that, and maintain, you know, the empathy. But again, I would just say, can you be empathetic toward the part that's learned this? Toward the part of the person that, just like everything else in our nervous system, is subject to causes and conditions. And that in this person, they've manifested in a certain way, most likely because of what their perceived safety or survival was, which we know is based on fake news because of this white supremacist culture that has created these false hierarchies and whatnot. But that there's perhaps something underneath that. And, you know, in a subcortical synaptic sort of unlocking in the limbic brain, are we able to kind of find out what the emotional learning is there with the client that has them sort of fused in a certain kind of way, and open up a curiosity around that. And as you notice what's coming up for you, you say, I have a hard time being empathetic with racist or entitled attitudes. Maybe checking in with yourself. Where am I feeling this in my body? Who does that remind me of? Who in my lifetime or who in my history felt like they were entitled? And maybe I didn't get what I needed. And now I'm feeling like this is particularly challenging for me here with this client. Santa Teresa, can you let us know more about the workshop with you and Richard Schwartz? Yes. I did a podcast with him for Ram Dass's Be Here Now network, for my podcast Rerooted, where there's a conversation that he talks about these cultural legacy burdens. And based on that conversation, when I was asked to do a class for Therapy Wisdom, which is an online portal that some of you know, Janina Fisher, who uses parts work along with sensory motor psychotherapy, primarily to deal with dissociation and trauma with clients, is offering a current course with, that I went back to Dick and I said, you're working with Duran Yan of Black Therapist Rock. You've done a lot of work to try and create, for example, retreat style trainings specifically for Black IFS therapists. And you're also recognizing that there are these, you know, cultural legacy burdens of patriarchy, racism, individualism, and materialism that are afflicting us all, right? That sort of are the four-legged chairs of whiteness, if you will. And that they're killing everyone, whether it's suicidality in certain, you know, white male populations, or the opioid addiction, but that they disproportionately, in all the ways that we've talked about when it comes to COVID and pre-existing health conditions, racism being that, and all of the structural pieces, you know, disproportionately affect Black people and people of color. So Dick really kind of, I think, is one of the people in these trauma communities who kinds of gets it. I have not talked to, and I've interviewed Peter also. And I had, you know, was met with disappointment when I had that conversation a year ago, to be honest, about sort of a leaning into this. But Dick seems to kind of get it. The class will be offered in October. I guess I can give you more information about it through the SETI website or something, but it'll be on Therapy Wisdom. Javier Pineda, can you talk about your experiences you developed as a practitioner in SC? It sounds like a white space with many white leaders and gatekeepers. What has that been like? Yes, you're right. And that's why I'm glad that at least we're starting to try to have these conversations. I think that Michelle is going to be doing a webinar tomorrow, the next day, with Joshua Silve and with Danielle Coward. And they're going to be sort of talking more about these kinds of issues, I think. Let's think about this in a broader context. What is the point of somatic experiencing? Trauma resolution, what does that mean? rebalancing the nervous system. What does that mean? Being able to exist comfortably in our window of tolerance. What does that mean? Being able to feel relaxed and alert, noble and dignified, like we're not under threat all the time, or as one of my clients says, feeling hunted, right? This is where we have space to breathe, to exist. What was denied George Floyd, which was denied Eric Garner, which was denied so many people in this country based on these systems, because people wanted to extract wealth, money off of the labor of Black bodies, which they did for centuries and still do, as we see the delivery people for COVID being primarily Black and brown, right? Is SETI or SE a white space? In my experience, most certainly it has been. What has it been like with many white leaders and gatekeepers for me, I guess? I was there was a white Mexican woman who flew up for our training in New York. To my knowledge, I was the only woman of color in my New York City cohort. I graduated 3 years ago, maybe. There was one woman who came, who was Black, young woman, I believe in graduate school, to the first weekend. And I remember saying to Nancy Napier and Maureen afterwards, I noticed that on the last day, she's not here. We need to do better. You know, you're in this circle or whatever it is, and everybody's sharing their experiences of like, oh, you know, it's a kumbaya. And I'm like, that's bullshit. There's no kumbaya. Where was the conversation that we're supposed to be having to see and check in with how this is for this person here, given their experience, is necessarily going to be different, especially in a trauma healing community, if we're just recreating the kind of trauma that's experienced out there and we're not naming it. We're not paying any attention to it. And of course, there was an acknowledgement at that time to say, yes, that's not so good. But, you know, then there was nothing made of it. And then as I go on as an SE assistant, I was with Burns, Galloway in Maryland before the pandemic. There was a cohort that was specifically created for trying to, I think Karen and Barbara created this idea of trying to have there be more accessible trainings for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to access it, you know, financially. And that there were a lot of different, that cohort was much more diverse. I think it was about 25% BIPOC, folks of different abilities. We had people that were, you know, available for sign language, and it was much more accessible. But even there were issues around how is there even a safe container being created or not within who or how could speak, and how and why, and who was taking up space or centering. And there was a group of assistants that were Black, and there were, you know, assistants who were white and perhaps other ethnicities too. But I think we had real-time in vivo conversations in that group. And to Burns's credit, to be perfectly honest, I feel we leaned into it more and we made adjustments as we went along in the training. So I would like to think more of that can happen or is happening now. I don't know. There was a post in one of the Facebook groups, the SETI or Somatic Experiencing Facebook groups, that asked someone, that was asking, like, out of all these trauma trainings, what are the things that you should look out for or ask them in order to assess their ability to be anti-racist? And I just sort of had a stream of consciousness, and I'll share some of these with you. I don't know if they're helpful or not. I said, perhaps you'd like to ask questions such as, and these are things that I would submit to SETI now, what percentage of your faculty or students or leadership are Black, TGNC, POC? What's your scholarship or sliding scale policy? What are the ways in which you create safe spaces for people who are not white, cis, het? What or how do you use the ritual or group exercises to actually bond the group somatically instead of just didactic teaching? What kind of dress codes do you encourage or allow? Do you include music, dance, song, or writing into your trainings? Do you work somatically or limbically in vivo as part of the training, or is it only left brain? How much teaching of history of different experiences do you do as part of the training itself? And I think that's what Danielle and Josh are going to be addressing in terms of the curriculum changes. What are your safe space guidelines? Do you say up front, for example, courage and renewals touchstones or AAC here, stay here? What do you do in order to keep privacy? How do people stay connected in between modules? Can that be changed at all? We know that we are wounded together, we heal together, and there are these sort of privacy issues around SETI not being able to share other people's emails, which I agree with, but how is that being encouraged in a different way that people can self-organize? What kinds of community participation is someone doing parallel to the involvement in the process of the actual training? Meaning, if we're at we're showing up for this trauma healing training, but what are we actually doing in community? I know many of you already do that, but what are the faculty doing? What are the people who are the assistants doing? What are the rules for speaking, et cetera? Is there a talking stick or something like that? Anyway, those are some of the ideas. But I do think that SETI, I really did not have much hope, to be honest. I know people who've left the board after years of service. And I've spoken to Marv a couple times and some of the other folks. And I just think that there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of privilege that now is sort of being woken up. And I'm hopeful. Nobody can guarantee anything, but I think that, it is hopeful. Jahan Sabdar, we often hear that there is a need for more therapists of color, but something that doesn't get addressed enough is racism and discrimination within the mental health field, including in graduate school. Absolutely. How can we advocate for more proactive anti-racist and anti-oppression action in the field that goes beyond diversity and inclusion? Right? We know that doesn't work. Many people of color worry about facing negative consequences from speaking up about racism because we're often perceived as being too angry or sensitive. I agree. I think this speaks to your theme about the difficulties of discussing racism. Thank you for that thoughtful comment. I appreciate it. And yes, to all of it. Here's the thing. It's on white people to take on this work. White identified, light skin passing, light racially advantaged, some of my Asian American, Korean American, Chinese American therapist friends have also agreed. One of them said the other day, I think she said, the go-to or the first response was white is right, meaning that them as immigrants from Korea sort of allied themselves with whatever the dominant narrative was, and had a lot of sort of having to go up the ladder in terms of, not knowing if they were going to be able to pay rent or make it through and whatnot. And yet she and I had this sort of conversation for this Inside Out TV show that I do Wednesdays. You could watch the replay if you want, where she was talking about, I woke up, like I didn't realize that I was identifying with the oppressor. I didn't realize that even though I was a woman of color, even though I was Korean American, that it was easier for me to be able to talk from the white perspective. And to the earlier questioner's point about what happens when someone brings up a racist attitude in session, this Korean American therapist was saying, oh yeah, when the person who owns a grocery store, a Korean grocery store, comes into session and says, oh yeah, it's always the Black people who are stealing things from my store. And I would just sit and listen empathically, as the other questioner said. I didn't realize that that wasn't okay. And now I do. Now I'm changing, and now I'm inviting more of a conversation. But I had to say to her, well, I don't even know if that's true, meaning I wasn't there around whatever happened to the store owner, but I am curious about what might it be like that would create the causes and conditions for anyone, to have to take food or something that they weren't able to purchase with money in the first place. What does it mean to not have as much money? Where would it come from that somebody might not have as much? What are the systems that would be behind that, especially if you're Black in this country? Do we know what those are? And I'm not saying that, this was that. I'm saying, can we invite in those kinds of questions? Meaning, can we start to think from an ecological perspective or from a systems perspective, and not see us as, different things, meaning that, there's a reason why, if we invite in this kind of sense of curiosity and actually naming it, we can hold space for both, this brave space. As far as being negative, being told that we're angry happens to me all the time. You're too smart, you know too much, you're too angry, you're too loud, you're too big, you're too sensitive, you're like a peeled grape. I mean, those are just a few. I'm like, yeah, maybe to you, maybe for you, but how do you do a better job, you the other, of being able to recognize that you can come from the I perspective and say, I'm finding it challenging to take in all of whatever it is that I'm experiencing in your presence right now. I don't know any white person who actually ever does that, but I think it would be a good exercise for them. Or I'm feeling ashamed, or I'm feeling like I did something wrong, because we hear people say, oh, you know, I'm not racist, I'm not racist, I'm not racist. I had somebody who trained me in couples therapy. I had this long conversation about these things with them over lunch in a training one day, and then came back and say, I know I'm a lot of things. And this is to the whole audience of 50 people. I know one thing, I know I'm not racist. I'm like, in this society, you want to be an anti-racist racist, meaning you can't say you're not racist, because you probably are. I admit to, again, using Ditch Schwartz's language, racist parts that are actively trying to be aware and leaning into embodying anti-racism and interrogating whiteness, and even the ways in which I am here even today. So we can't change what other people do, or how, as Lama Rod said earlier, how they consent or not consent. But we can't consent to the way other people are seeing us, but we can look at how we are, what we do. Jennifer Jones, we have about 10 minutes left. As a Gestalt therapy trainer, I've been trying to get white folks to realize that if they're being present and feeling into the field or environment, they know when they have microaggressed. I've been trying to get white folks to realize if they're being present and feeling into the field or the environment, they know when they have microaggressed. Okay, when they're offending. The temperature of the room changes. Breath, physical, stance, tone, all shifts. The muscle is needed to then lean into the discomfort to own what is happening. Yes. How does SC talk about being able to feel into and address these charges, moments that are subtle, so white folks don't wait for BIPOC to do it? Well, again, let's just name it a million times. Racism, whiteness, white racial advantage, white body supremacy, organizational trauma within SETI, the perpetuation of organizational trauma, through the various modules and trainings. All of that's true. It's happened. It's all true. And feeling into and addressing these charges, these charged moments that are so subtle, white folks don't need to wait for BIPOC to do it, is to start to notice the subtlety. Just like we ask when we're checking in with folks to actually actively interrogate whiteness regularly. I'm a white body doing trauma work right now. How am I leaning into checking in with, is there tightness here? Is there a gray cloud here? Is there a sinking feeling here? Is there a push away energy here? Can I name this? Can I lean into this? And accountability, right? Oops, ouch. You've, yucked my yum. I've yucked your yum. I take accountability and ownership of that. Remorse is beautiful. Own it. It's fine. Lean into it. It doesn't mean that you're a horrible person that's going to have to, die at the bottom of, the pit. It means that you made a mistake or you caused a harm, and own it. And if the person doesn't want to receive or whatever that is, that's okay too. You're learning. Give up false power. Beautiful, Patty. Farah one. I think the point is freedom is not pie. One person having freedom doesn't mean you automatically must oppress another. Exactly. And that's why I want to shift from a space of thinking about things as sort of a zero-sum game, win or lose, black or white, this or that, to a place where we can think and change the way that we actually collectively think about this. If you look at Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote The Body is Not an Apology, she's actually transforming the capitalistic model into one of mutual aid in terms of buying black debt for her student loans. That's a shift in the way that we think about money, resources, and what's available in terms of having a certain set, scarcity versus this abundance that can be generated when we set our intentions to that. So as a mindfulness practitioner, we know that, you know, we strengthen, you know, whatever it is that we turn our attention to. So where we turn our attention to grows. So this idea of power and equity that is the whole piece around race, patriarchy, imperialism that we want to upend and think differently about. Farah, again, I do think personal sacrifice is helpful, stepping back to the more inclusive, looking around the table and asking if it's truly diverse and if the people of color there have a voice or ability to lead, make decisions, et cetera. But that doesn't mean less freedom for you. It's just sharing that space and sharing the spotlight. Well, you know, again, am I allowing my own inner dignity and my own spotlight to come forward? Do I feel like I'm enough and I matter, whether I'm silent and I'm sitting quietly with my hands folded in my lap, or do I feel like I need to always be the one who's centering myself and taking up space? Or do I feel like the one who needs to stay in the back of the corner? Because that's what I did need to do when I was a kid, and it helped me survive then, but I'm still burdened by that or holding on to that in a way that perhaps maybe isn't only necessary right now. What happens when I allow there to be more space for BIPOC to step in? Can I trust that? How do I notice when there's something coming up in me that may not, and acknowledge it and nod to it and say, thank you. Ah, interesting. Yeah, there's a part of me that is noticing that or feels a certain kind of way about that. And I can also just allow. Okay, we have a couple more and only a few more minutes. Anonymous, I'm a Filipino-American woman of color. I was accepted into grad school for counseling. Psychology, it didn't sit right in my body and I declined. I'm interested in somatic experiencing. Are there any other programs you recommend to offer decolonized therapeutic practices? Yes, and this gets back to the other question I didn't really answer about the institutionalized academic piece. Again, I did an Inside Out TV show with Dr. Natasha Stovall about this 2 weeks ago. If you want to check it out, you can. But how do we begin to interrogate institutions? For example, psychoanalysis, which is certainly not SE, but still, a therapeutic arena, still uses words like primitive, as Carl Jung in Psychoanalytic Training Institutions wrote them back in 1930 in its current trainings. That's not okay. But white people need to say that that's not okay and change that, not only Black people in those trainings. Okay. So back to this question of somatic experiencing, are there other programs that I recommend? I think Dr. Jennifer Mullen does a wonderful job with decolonizing therapy. Decolonized therapeutic practices, I think, include those by Dr. Michael Yellowbird that I mentioned before on neurodecolonization. I think that any of these decolonized therapeutic practices that are collectivists are things, like I said, resourcing, being together in certain ways that we may not call talk therapy or group therapy. Maybe dancing, it may be cooking. Amy DiGennaro, Joshua Silve has been doing a phenomenal job with this despite no top-down mandate to root the training in anti-racist praxis. I agree, I trained with Josh also, and he is amazing. Our cohort, Minneapolis, is very diverse and strong. We in the Twin Cities as a cohort, strong BIPOC and LGBTQ TGNC, have a collective will to decenter whiteness and to actively anti-racist. Joshua has been very skillfully embracedly elevated the group's will and held space to co-create a brave space for us in our learning. It needs to happen at the systemic level with SETI. Happy to be here today with you and grateful to have this platform to bring forth these important issues. Yeah, thank you, Amy. I agree. Josh is certainly one of the folks, along with Burns, I think also, who is really trying to move this conversation front and center in an embodied way, even as a white man, because it's the right thing to do. And there are going to be blind spots there. So we're just going to deal with it, but that the intention and the embodied action is there. Marita, thank you, Francesca. You've offered a stimulating conversation for waking up to who we are with all our parts. As a Mexican, Spanish, First Nation, Polish, cis woman born of maternal and paternal refugees, it's a long process of healing. It certainly is, Marita. And, I just want to, as it's 2:29 and we're going to close soon, really acknowledge that this was probably highly imperfect. I'm sure it did not meet everyone's needs. that I hope to have created enough of a safe space where there was an exploration and an invitation. And I'm realizing that even in this, with the questions, that there are things that I can do differently. Perhaps going forward, should I ever engage in these conversations again. But I'd really like to invite you all to feel free to follow up with me with whatever kind of feedback or whatever kind of, things that you might want to share by going to my website if you want, which is maximeclarity.com. My last name, M-A-X-I-M like Mary, E, clarity, like I see clearly, CLARITY.com, and just sending me an email through the form submission or sending it to info@francescamaxime.com. And I'm happy to continue the dialogue. I'm teachable, I'm humble, I come with you with a lot of respect and appreciation. And I really admire that all of us are leaning into this work and really beginning to interrogate whiteness, talk about racism, and how to become an embodied anti-racist. And with that, I just want to take a breath and feel our feet on the floor. Inviting in our deepest intention. May all beings be safe. May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. And may all beings live with joy and with ease of heart. And may we dedicate this time together for our practice together to the benefit of all beings. Thank you so much.
Francesca, thank you so much on behalf of Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute. Thank you so much for holding everything with such compassion and intelligence and curiosity and warmth. I really value you tremendously in this community. And I appreciate all of your insights. And on that note, I wish everyone a very, very good day, reflective, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.